In this episode, we begin with a topic that often feels confusing to new learners because the words sound related, but they do not mean the same thing. People hear control, standard, and framework used in the same meaning, and it can sound as if they are just different labels for security rules. They are connected, but each one plays a different role in how an organization manages risk and turns good intentions into reliable practice. For someone studying certified in risk and information systems control, CRISC, understanding that relationship is essential because risk management is not just about spotting threats. It is also about knowing how organizations organize their defenses, define expectations, and build repeatable ways of working. Controls are the actual safeguards or activities that reduce risk. Standards define the required level or method for doing something, and frameworks give the organization a structure for thinking about and coordinating the whole effort. Once those pieces start to separate in your mind, this subject becomes much easier to follow and much more useful in real-world decision-making. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A control is any measure, action, rule, mechanism, or practice that helps reduce the likelihood of a bad event, reduce the impact if it happens, or improve the organization's ability to notice and respond. That definition is intentionally broad because beginners often imagine controls as only technical products, such as firewalls or antivirus tools. In reality, a control can be a background check before hiring, a locked server room door, a manager approval step for sensitive access, a reconciliation of financial records, a review of system logs, or a plan for restoring operations after a disruption. The easiest way to understand a control is to think of it as something designed to influence risk in a useful way. Some controls stop problems before they happen, some reveal that something is going wrong, and some help the organization recover after damage has already begun. A control is not valuable just because it exists. It is valuable when it meaningfully supports business objectives while reducing exposure in a way that is dependable, understandable, and appropriate for the environment where it is used. That broader definition matters because security and risk problems almost never come from just one missing technology setting. They usually come from combinations of weak decisions, inconsistent behavior, poor design, missing oversight, and gaps in accountability. A company can buy excellent security tools and still experience serious failures if no one reviews alerts, access approvals are sloppy, backup testing is neglected, or sensitive processes are built on trust instead of verification. This is why CRISC thinking treats controls as part of a wider system of governance and operations rather than as isolated objects. Controls support business goals by making outcomes more predictable and less fragile. They give leaders a way to say that important activities should happen consistently and risky behaviors should not be left to chance. A useful mental model is to picture risk as a river that will keep flowing unless something channels it, slows it, watches it, or helps the organization survive when it overflows. Controls are those channels, barriers, warning signals, and recovery mechanisms working together rather than a single perfect wall. One common way to classify controls is by what they are meant to accomplish. Preventive controls are designed to stop unwanted events before they occur, such as strong access approvals, secure coding requirements, or separation of duties in financial and technology processes. Detective controls are meant to reveal that something has happened or is happening, such as monitoring, exception reports, alarm systems, or periodic reviews that identify unusual behavior. Corrective controls help fix conditions after a problem is discovered, while recovery controls help restore services or data after disruption or loss. These labels are useful because they remind us that organizations need more than one kind of protection. If a company relies only on preventive controls, it may miss the fact that prevention eventually fails somewhere. If it relies only on detection, it may discover trouble constantly, but reduce very little actual risk. Strong environments usually include a mix of prevention, detection, correction, and recovery because risk management is stronger when it assumes that some things will go wrong and prepares accordingly. Another helpful classification focuses on intent in a slightly different way. Directive controls tell people what they are expected to do, which makes policies, standards, training requirements, and formal procedures important parts of the control environment. Deterrent controls try to discourage bad behavior by making the consequences or visibility clear, such as warning banners, visible cameras, strong disciplinary language, or audit trails that remind people they can be held accountable. Compensating controls are especially important in risk discussions because they provide an alternative way to reduce risk when the preferred or primary control cannot be implemented fully. A legacy system might not support modern authentication features, for example, so the organization may strengthen monitoring, reduce network exposure, or require extra approvals around its use. For beginners, compensating controls are a reminder that risk management is often practical rather than ideal. The best answer is not always available immediately, so the organization must decide whether another measure can reduce the exposure enough to make the situation tolerable for a limited time or under specific conditions. Controls are also commonly grouped by their nature, which helps explain where they live and how they operate. Administrative controls are based on management direction, human processes, and organizational expectations. These include policies, governance structures, job responsibilities, training, vendor review practices, approval workflows, and other management-driven measures that shape behavior and accountability. Technical controls are built into systems, applications, and devices, such as encryption, access restrictions, automated monitoring, system configuration rules, and other machine-enforced protections. Physical controls protect facilities, equipment, and tangible assets through things like locks, badges, barriers, cameras, environmental protections, and access restrictions to sensitive spaces. A beginner should not assume one category is always stronger than another. These categories are most effective when they reinforce one another. A batch-controlled data center entrance is more reliable when supported by policy, oversight, and logging, just as a system access control is more reliable when tied to formal role definitions, manager approvals, and periodic review instead of standing alone as a purely technical setting. There is another distinction that matters in real organizations, and that is the difference between manual and automated controls. Manual controls depend heavily on people to perform them correctly and consistently, such as reviewing access lists, approving changes, checking reconciliations, or following documented procedures. Automated controls are performed by systems with limited need for human action once configured, such as preventing unauthorized connections, blocking prohibited actions, or generating alerts when activity crosses a threshold. Hybrid controls combine both elements, which is common in practice because a system may automatically collect data while humans still review exceptions or make final decisions. Beginners sometimes assume automated controls are always better, but that is too simple. Automation can improve consistency and scale, yet it can also fail silently if configured badly or left unreviewed. Manual controls can provide human judgment and context, but they can also be slow, inconsistent, and vulnerable to fatigue. Good control design recognizes the strengths and weaknesses of each approach and chooses the mix that best supports the risk being managed. Control quality matters just as much as control category, because not every control that exists is well designed or effective. A weak control may be too vague, too easy to bypass, too dependent on perfect human behavior, or too disconnected from the actual risk it is supposed to address. A strong control usually has a clear purpose, fits the business process where it operates, assigns responsibility clearly, and can be monitored or validated over time. This is why risk professionals care about design as well as operation. A beautifully written policy is not much help if no one knows it exists, no supporting process makes it real, and no leader checks whether behavior actually changed. A technical setting may look impressive during a demonstration and still fail in production because it was not mapped to the real workflow, real users, or real data flows of the organization. Controls must be realistic enough to be followed, specific enough to be understood, and strong enough to reduce meaningful exposure instead of giving everyone a false sense of safety. Once you understand what controls are, the next important step is understanding what a standard is. A standard is a required rule or baseline that tells the organization how something must be done in a specific area so that expectations are consistent and not left entirely to personal preference. Standards sit below high-level policy and above detailed procedures in many organizations. A policy states what the organization intends or requires in broad terms, while a standard gives clearer, more specific requirements that support that policy, and a procedure explains the steps people follow to carry the requirement out. For example, a policy may require the protection of sensitive data, while a standard may define minimum encryption expectations, retention rules, or access approval requirements. Beginners often confuse standards with controls because both influence behavior, and there is some overlap in practice. The easiest way to separate them is to remember that a standard defines the required condition or baseline, while a control is the safeguard or activity that helps enforce, verify, or support that baseline in actual operations. Standards matter because they reduce inconsistency and create a common operating baseline across teams, systems, and business functions. Without standards, one team may configure access very strictly while another makes informal exceptions, and both may believe they are acting responsibly. That inconsistency makes risk harder to understand and harder to manage because leaders cannot assume that similar assets are being protected in similar ways. Standards also help organizations scale because they let people build and operate within known boundaries rather than reinventing expectations every time a new system, vendor, or process appears. In regulated or highly audited environments, standards provide evidence that the organization has translated broad obligations into concrete internal requirements. A beginner should also recognize that standards are not valuable only because auditors like them. They are valuable because they turn general intentions into repeatable operating discipline. When standards are clear, current, and realistic, they make it easier for teams to know what good looks like and harder for risky shortcuts to hide behind ambiguity or personal judgment. A framework is broader than a standard and much broader than a single control. A framework provides a structured way to organize thinking, responsibilities, categories, and objectives so the organization can approach risk and control work in a coherent way. Frameworks help leaders ask whether important areas are being covered, how responsibilities connect, how maturity can improve over time, and how different controls and standards fit into a larger picture. Well-known examples include control objectives for information and related technologies, COBIT, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, Cybersecurity Framework, CSF, and the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, family of security guidance and management approaches. You do not need to treat these as magic books with one perfect answer inside them. Their real value is that they provide common language, common categories, and a disciplined structure for planning, evaluating, and improving controls. For a beginner, a framework is less like a lock on a door and more like the blueprint that shows where locks, alarms, responsibilities, reviews, and recovery plans belong across the whole building. Frameworks become especially useful when organizations need alignment across business units, technical teams, risk teams, auditors, and leadership. Different groups often care about the same underlying risk in different ways. Security teams may focus on system protection, business leaders may focus on continuity and cost, and auditors may focus on evidence and accountability. A framework helps those groups speak to one another using a shared structure instead of debating every issue from scratch. That structure also makes it easier to identify gaps. If a framework shows that the organization has mature technical protections but weak governance, poor recovery planning, or inconsistent third-party oversight, leaders can see that risk is broader than any one control category. This matters in CRISC because risk management is not simply a matter of collecting controls until the environment looks busy. It is about making sure those controls are connected to business objectives, supported by clear requirements, and situated inside a governance model that can explain why they exist, who owns them, and how their performance will be reviewed. The most practical way to connect these ideas is to picture a chain from broad guidance to day-to-day action. A framework helps the organization understand the domains or categories it should manage. Standards define the minimum expectations that support those categories in a consistent way. Controls are then chosen and implemented to meet those expectations and reduce specific risks within actual processes and systems. Imagine an organization trying to strengthen access management. A framework may highlight identity, access, governance, and monitoring as important areas. Internal standards may then require timely approvals, periodic review, minimum authentication requirements, and removal of access when roles change. Controls would include approval workflows, system settings, logging, review activities, and management oversight that make those standards real. That chain matters because problems often begin when one link is weak. An organization may adopt a respected framework but fail to translate it into clear standards, or it may write solid standards but never implement effective controls to support them. Real maturity comes from connecting the big picture to the daily operating reality. A common beginner mistake is to assume frameworks and standards should be followed blindly without regard to business context. Mature organizations do not copy large bodies of guidance word for word and hope that risk disappears. They interpret, adapt, prioritize, and implement in ways that fit their size, regulatory environment, technology footprint, risk appetite, and business objectives. A small company and a global financial institution may both use the same framework language, yet the depth, formality, and control choices can differ greatly. That does not mean anything goes. It means good risk management requires judgment. Another mistake is assuming that if a framework exists, the organization must already be secure. A framework is only a structure, and a standard is only a requirement on paper until real controls operate consistently and leadership continues to care about whether they work. Beginners should remember that frameworks guide, standards define, and controls do the practical work of influencing risk in the places where business actually happens. A simple example brings the whole topic together. Imagine a healthcare organization that wants to protect patient data while keeping systems available for daily care. Its chosen framework helps leadership organize responsibilities around governance, protection, detection, response, and recovery. Its standards define things like required authentication strength, time frames for removing and used access, expectations for vendor handling of sensitive data, and minimum backup requirements for critical systems. Its controls then make those requirements operational through access approval processes, system restrictions, logging, training, physical protection of equipment, monitoring of unusual activity, and regular recovery testing. If a leader asks whether the organization is managing risk responsibly, the answer cannot come from only one of those layers. The framework shows whether the right areas are being considered, the standards show what the organization expects, and the controls show how those expectations are actually carried out. That is why all three ideas belong together. They are different, but they become most powerful when they are designed to support one another instead of existing as separate conversations. As we close, the most important lesson is that controls, standards, and frameworks are not competing concepts. They are connected layers of a mature risk and security program, each doing a different job. Controls are the safeguards and activities that directly influence risk. Standards define the required baseline that makes protection consistent, and frameworks provide the larger structure that helps the organization organize, evaluate, and improve its overall approach. CRISC expects you to recognize those relationships because risk management becomes much more effective when the organization can move clearly from broad guidance to specific expectations and then to real operational behavior. When beginners first hear these terms, they can sound abstract, but they become much easier to understand once you picture how they work together inside an actual business. The organization needs a way to think, a way to define, and a way to act. Frameworks help it think, standards help it define, and controls help it act in ways that reduce uncertainty and support dependable outcomes.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.